Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arlett. From a series of phone calls all the way to a failed European summit, we've got you covered this week. But first, let's go to the most important stories coming straight out of Ukraine.
President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has announced Ukrainian and American delegations will meet again in Saudi Arabia to discuss steps towards a ceasefire with Russia. A U.S. delegation is also set to meet separately with Russian officials the same day in Riyadh on March 24th. Kyiv was open to a U.S. proposed 30-day ceasefire, but is now considering a partial truce after Moscow's rejection of a full halt in hostilities. Following the March 18th call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, both sides have agreed to cease strikes on energy infrastructure. Talks will likely include discussions on Black Sea navigation security, similar to the collapsed Black Sea grain initiative, brokered by the UN and Turkey in 2022. The call between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump on March 18th concluded with an agreement to hold energy infrastructure strikes. Ukraine was receptive to the pause, but President Volodymyr Zelenskyy insisted on further discussions. He also dismissed Russian demands to hold foreign military aid as unrealistic, reaffirming Kyiv's continued support from allies. However, despite the Kremlin's supposed agreement, Russian missile and drone attacks against Ukraine have continued. Readouts of the call issued by the White House and the Kremlin varied in their wording, causing further confusion over what is covered by the partial ceasefire. Donald Trump also held a one-hour call with Volodymyr Zelenskyy on March 19th, discussing Ukraine's needs and aligning positions after Trump's earlier conversation with Vladimir Putin. Zelenskyy dismissed Putin's promises, stating Putin's words are very different from reality. Meanwhile, a Ukraine-Russia prisoner exchange took place on March 19th, with over 23 wounded Ukrainian soldiers released. Despite Vladimir Putin's announcement of a partial ceasefire, Russian missile and drone strikes against Ukraine continue mercilessly. In the 24 hours following the ceasefire order, Russian forces launched numerous attacks, killing at least 5 civilians and injuring 26 others. Cities like Kropyvnytsky, Kherson and Kharkiv were targeted, with damage to homes, residential buildings and infrastructure. Ukrainian air defense intercepted 75 of 171 Russian drones, but several still caused destruction. In Kropyvnytsky, a significant drone strike injured 10, including 4 children. Volodymyr Zelenskyy condemned the ongoing strikes, calling Putin's false ceasefire pledge a rejection of peace efforts. Ukrainian drones successfully struck Russia's Engels 2 airbase in the Saratov region on March 20th, causing explosions and fires. The attack, the most intense effort targeting the base during the full-scale war, zeroed in on strategic bombers used for missile strikes on Ukraine. 2 civilians were injured and several buildings, including a hospital and schools, were damaged. The base, previously attacked in December 2022, houses bombers like the Tu-95, which carry deadly cruise missiles. Russian air defenses reportedly failed to intercept large amounts of drones fired by Kyiv's forces. In retaliation, Russia launched over 100 drones across Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has confirmed that additional F-16 fighter jets have arrived in Ukraine, but did not disclose the exact number or country of origin. He also dismissed Russian claims that one had been shot down in the Sumy region. Ukraine has long sought F-16s to strengthen its air defense and offensive capabilities. The first jets arrived in August 2024, after approval from Western allies. The Netherlands, Denmark, Norway and Belgium have all committed to supplying the aircraft, with varying numbers pledged.
And now joining us to discuss this week's developments is Yevgenia Kravchuk, Deputy Chair of the Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy in Ukraine. Yevgenia, thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Now, starting off with these phone calls that we had, first with Donald Trump and President Putin. The 2 leaders failed to get to a full-on ceasefire. However, They agreed that peace would begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on the implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. Now, this is something that Ukraine had brought to the table at the beginning when they started the talks in Jeddah. But I'm wondering now, would this benefit Russia more than it would Ukraine if that is indeed the starting point that we are going to take off upon when it comes to a ceasefire?
Well, at first we need to make sure that this starting point will start, because Ukraine is experiencing drones and missiles attack every night, despite of the phone calls that President Trump and Putin had. In any case, of course, Ukraine is ready to, take these first steps. And indeed, the position of our team in Jeddah was to have the ceasefire in the skies, basically, as a whole. Because if you just, take out the energy infrastructure, of course, it's not that, vitally important than, for example, it was during the winter. I mean, the winter has passed. We survived successfully this winter. And obviously, Russians were waiting and were waging big missile attacks when the frost was at the peak, at the very minuses. And of course, there's a lot more of the infrastructure that is civilian, and even the apartment buildings where people live that are under attack as well. So basically, President Zelenskyy said that the negotiation team that will go to Saudi Arabia again will have the list of the civilian infrastructure. And of course, I mean, everyone understands that targeting people that live in just their buildings and apartment buildings and houses is against all the rules of waging the war. If any rules can apply to Russia, because obviously they don't care.
With these really successful attacks that we've seen, these long-range drone attacks by Ukraine on Russian oil infrastructure, wouldn't this somewhat hinder Ukraine's ability to, let's say, take out key components of Russia's war machine at this point?
So basically, indeed, as I said, the energy infrastructure is very important, especially during the winter time. But we target the oil refineries throughout the year. But we still can get the oil refineries that are in the range of, a few hundred kilometers up to 1,000. Some of the long range is up to 2,000, and the missiles can reach 3,000. But obviously, it's, pretty difficult. So yes, it will influence. But again, we're speaking just about the short-term 30 days, and these days could continue, of course, but at the end of the day, we're looking for the long-lasting peace, and that's just a first step. If this is the first step that Ukraine has to take, so United States and President Trump will push more Russians, then, we're ready to do that. But of course, it cannot be just, the first step and then we'll stop.
And then, of course, also during this phone call, the issue of Ukraine's nuclear power plants came up. Vladimir Putin wanting the United States to take control of all of Ukraine's nuclear power plants for certain fears, unfounded fears that it has. But this brings up Zaporizhzhia and Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest one in Europe, right? We've seen how the Russians have used this as a base to stage attacks on Ukrainians and often claim the Ukrainians are striking back. Do you think some kind of U.S. investment in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant could be a potential solution to the security concerns that we see around Europe's largest power plant?
To begin with, Russians need to leave this territory, because power plant is not just floating in the air. It's the whole Enerhodar city, which is, a city close by to Zaporizhzhia power plant, where people who work there live, and also the infrastructure for the cooling. So it's something very more just the territory of the power plant. Indeed, it's very important infrastructural object. Indeed, it's the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. And it's always, sort of a ticking mechanism, because if Russians will be continuing to control it, they will try to use it to connect to the energy system, because right now it's not that much of working on the occupied territories. But also it is the hazard, because it's under the control of occupiers and very close to the front line. So I'm not very much aware of all this story about the nuclear power plant and how possible it is, but it's not just about the territory of the power plant. So if Russians are ready to step out, to leave this territory, sort of Americans, I can't really imagine the whole formula, how it would work. So it's just the first idea. But again, just let me say again, it's not just about the power plant. It's also the city that is occupied and needs to be freed.
Sure. Now, also in a readout of this phone call, before we move on, I wanted to ask you about this U.S.-Russia rapprochement. Are you afraid that the United States could potentially start lifting sanctions on Russia prematurely? And if so, what would be some of the most immediate risks that you would see if that indeed happened?
We have the whole complex of sanctions, and of course, the United States is the huge part of it because of the special banking systems. But also we have the sanctions of European Union and Great Britain, basically the G7 on the table. So United States cannot totally move out of the whole structure. And again, it will be quite difficult to explain lifting the sanctions if nothing happens. And so far, nothing happened. There was the conversation, there was a phone call. We are waiting for another round of negotiations during this weekend. But Ukraine is under attack. People are being killed. They still hold 19,000 of Ukrainian stolen, deported children. They have 16,000 of civilians in captivity. The territory is occupied. So basically, nothing happened to even talk about lifting the sanctions.
Right. Now, Donald Trump also held a telephone call with President Zelenskyy. What is the feeling in Ukraine after this phone call? I know a lot of people were holding their breaths, but does it seem like that Zelenskyy and Trump have restored the relationship for the most part, and that Ukraine's on a better track than it was, say, just a couple weeks ago?
Well, first of all, Ukraine is in better tracks than it was in 2022, right immediately after the attack. And right now, Ukraine is the biggest drone producers, for example, in the world. So I think that's something that Ukrainians are being worried, how much weapons we produce at our own country. So we do encourage any of the investments, foreign investments into our own weapons production. And of course, we need United States at the table, because remember in 2015, when the ceasefire during the Minsk agreement was reached, at the end of the day, it didn't last forever. And we didn't have the United States at the table. But also, it's very important to, and it's not just our feelings, also the feeling from Europe, that at the end of the day, the aggressor, the country that broke all rules, killed so many people, walk out with a reward. So I think that's the ultimate goal. And Ukrainians have, we understand the rules and everything, but we're not stepping over the so-called red line. So we're not, in any case, will never recognize the territories that are occupied. And of course, these things that Putin says that they put into constitution, the Russian constitution, the regions in their administrative borders, Yeah, that's, nonsense. So basically, Russia says that Ukraine has to step out of the territories that are not occupied because they put into their constitution, for example, Zaporizhia as a city and Kherson as a city. So negotiations are, it's an important thing, but we cannot lose sanity in the whole process.
Certainly. Now, I'd like to fast forward to this EU summit that was on Thursday. There was supposed to be 40 billion. They were trying to get 40 billion in military and other assistance for Ukraine, passed through that, and another 5 billion for about 2 million artillery rounds. None of those things passed. I think we can thank Hungary in large part to that. Do you think that there's a new type of format that needs to be created for the European nations which wish to contribute to Ukraine, and that is like under the coalition of the willing, for instance, so that someone like Hungary or a country like Hungary can't block this European initiative?
Well, indeed, it's usually 26 countries in favor and one against. But in this case, it was the 40 billion act. I'm not part, of course, of the whole negotiation process. But what I read in open source is not just Hungary who were not ready to step up. But again, sometimes EU needs more time for the decisions because it's 27 countries that it needs to say yes. So I imagine it's quite challenging. But at the end of the day, of course, it's the countries who are willing to do that and to move fast. So we're also waiting from this format to move further, the coalition of the willing, as you mentioned, basically the countries that met in London a few weeks ago. And it's not just EU because Canada was on board as well. And it's not just, again, EU because it's Norway, it's Turkey, and it's Great Britain. So I think that format is very promising one.
Indeed. Final question here, and this one has to deal with the Russian passports. Russia saying that all the Ukrainians in the illegally occupied territories need to accept Russian passports by September 10th, or else they will have to leave. What is the Ukrainian policy on this? What happens if Ukrainians under duress that are in those occupied territories have to take a Russian passport? Is there a policy in the Ukrainian government now for dealing with this?
So basically, we understand it's not just the willing of the people, so it's pressure from the occupation administration, and basically why they do it, because they want those people who are not willing to collaborate to leave, and they just expropriate their businesses, their houses, and will move Russians from the mainland Russia to these territories. That's what they did in Crimea. So that's the policy, to change the ethnical component on the occupied territories, because they understand that the population is hostile. So basically they want to keep those who are collaborators, and to bring Russians to their homes. And they did it, it's the strategy of many centuries. They did it before. So Ukraine does not recognize that if you are under pressure and if you take the Russian passport that's valid, they're still Ukrainian citizens for us. And of course, those who will be leaving will be welcomed in Ukraine. And of course, they could add to those millions of Ukrainians that are already in EU countries seeking for shelter. But it's another war crime. Of course, it's a war crime to this, passportization that they are doing.
To add upon the long list of other war crimes Russia has already committed. Evgenia Kravchuk, thank you very much for joining me, Deputy Chair of the Committee of Humanitarian and Information Policy in Ukraine. Thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine this week. Appreciate it. And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest stories and threads coming from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you then. Goodbye.